I'm standing right next to the unfinished railroad, the independent line of the Manassas Gap Railroad, which had been started in the 1850s but never completed. This railroad grade proved to be an ideal defensive position for the troops under Stonewall Jackson during the Second Battle of Manassas. From this position they could load and fire with perfect cover and concealment and pour a very heavy volume of fire into the advancing Union forces. Bradley Johnson left a very graphic after-action report, and in that report he stressed that the Union lines were well within 100 yards of the troops in his cut, and he saw a Union flag go down 6 or 8 times. And after the fight, there was well over 100 dead lying out here in front of the cut, some of them within 2 feet of it. Afterwards, as the Union Army retreated, Johnson described the scene. The whole field was covered with a confused mass of struggling, running, routed Yankees. And from here you can see, off to our southeast, the open ground that the Union Army had to cross in order to reach the unfinished railroad. 500 yards of open ground. It was like shooting fish in a barrel for the Confederates. And there was only a small area where the Union Army could take refuge from Confederate fire, just 100 yards in front of the railroad cut. But there they were still subjected to very intense artillery fire, coming from the Confederate artillery about a half a mile off to the west on Jackson's right flank. And that artillery fire contributed greatly to thinning the Union lines and ultimately causing the repulse of discount orders troops. Shortly after the war, in June of 1865, Union troops that were stationed in this area decided to erect 2 monuments on the battlefield, one to commemorate the patriots who fell during the First Battle of Manassas. That monument was placed on Henry Hill near the site of the Henry House. And the other monument was placed here in front of the unfinished railroad in the vicinity of the Deep Cut. This is where the attack on August 30th was centered and where some of the heaviest casualties were suffered. This monument, however, was on private land. This land belonged to the Dogan family, and they did not really ask permission of the Dogans whether they wanted a monument on their property, but the Dogans were stuck with it nonetheless. There was no funding to maintain the monument or preserve it. Eventually, this whole area became wooded, and the monument was buried deep in the woods. During the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century, a man by the name of George Carr Round, a Union veteran who lived in Manassas, began campaigning to try to preserve this land as a battlefield park. His efforts were largely unsuccessful. He never lived to see his dream come to fruition. But in the 1930s, the federal government began acquiring acreage here, which was then developed under the auspices of the WPA. And in 1940, Manassas National Battlefield Park was created with an initial 1,600 acres. But none of this land was included in that initial acreage. It took additional legislation from Congress in the 1950s to actually authorize the acquisition of this land here, which was associated with the Second Battle of Manassas. So it was in the 1950s that the Park Service first acquired this land, and at the time the area was still heavily wooded. And we have cleared out many of the trees today, so you can get a better sense of the ground where some of the heaviest fighting at Second Manassas took place.